Welcome to today's web seminar. This is Simone Turek-Lee with John Burton Advocates for Youth, and we'll get started in 1 minute. Hello, good morning. Welcome to the web seminar, Bridging the Gap, Connecting College Campuses to the Homelessness Response System. This is Simone Turek-Lee. I'm with John Burton Advocates for Youth, and we always like to start our webinars off with a little bit of technical support. So if you're listening through your computer speakers and would like to call in by phone for better sound, so if you're picking up any audio issues, the call-in information is on the screen there, and then it can also be found in your control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And as you can see there, we're holding a question and answer session toward the end of the webinar, so please don't hesitate throughout the webinar if you have any questions. No question is a bad question. Submit it again in your control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. There should be a little box that says questions, and you should be able to submit it there. And then we always post our presentations on our website, and we also record the web seminars and make the recording available. We will send it out via email as well to everyone who registered today. So if you don't want to wait for it to be posted, you'll get it later today. So we are hosting this web seminar kind of in response to something that I think has been discussed more and more in recent years, which is the significant numbers of homeless students on our state's college and university campuses. Kind of in consulting with partners that we work with at the California Community College Chancellor's Office, the California Community College Foundation, those involved with the Basic Needs Initiative at the four-year institutions, the California Homeless Youth Project, and many other partners. I think we all agree there's this gap, hence the webinar title, between the system or the set of supports that exist to address homelessness in our state and our post-secondary education institutions. And that's an issue because staff on these college campuses need to know how to connect their students to services and supports. And so this web seminar is truly to bridge this gap. We know that campuses across the state are really grappling with how to meet the needs of their students experiencing housing instability. And perhaps there are certainly campuses out there that are already utilizing some of the strategies that we'll talk about today. But we've largely heard that when it comes to housing, they really need more information and more support. There's definitely a lot of really creative and great things happening to address food insecurity on campuses and other basic needs. We know that housing is a little more difficult. And so we hope that this web seminar gives campuses some tools and some information to go there really and do what people are saying is really the hardest thing to do, which is to address housing instability and homelessness. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce this rock star lineup of presenters we have today who are going to take us through the agenda that you see here on the screen. And first I'm going to start with, and this is in alpha order, Cecilia Cruz. And Cecilia is the Student Health Center Coordinator at East Los Angeles College. We also have Colleen Ganley-Ammerman, and Colleen is the Student Mental Health Specialist at the California Community College Chancellor's Office. Jacqueline Grant is the Youth Coordinated Entry System Coordinator at Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, and LAHSA is LA's Continuum of Care, which you'll hear about later. Eric Hubbard is the Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships at Homelessness, Inc. Homelessness is a housing and service provider organization that is located in Los Angeles. Shahira Hyatt is the Director of the California Homeless Youth Project, which is a research and policy initiative of the California Research Bureau. We have Hope Kamer. Hope is a second-year master's student at UC Berkeley in the School of Social Welfare, and we are lucky enough to have her here as our intern this year at J-Bay. And Hope helped organize this webinar and develop some of the supplemental materials based on a survey that she administered to all continuums of care in our state. So thank you, Hope, for that work. And then we have Jillian Morchetti, a staff attorney at Home Base. Home Base is a San Francisco-based nonprofit public interest law firm dedicated to homelessness, working at the state and the local level. And Jillian is a HUD technical assistance provider, so she's really going to give us a lot of that background info on continuums of care and HUD funding. And then, like I said, I am Simone Turek-Lee, and I am with John Burton Advocates for Youth. And I'm getting messages in the questions box saying, this is a super team. I agree. This is truly a great lineup of presenters, and we are very lucky to have everyone here today and available. So thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm now first going to turn it over to Colleen Ganley-Ammerman with the Chancellor's Office, and Colleen's going to give us some background information about homelessness on our campuses, and then Shahira Hyatt is going to chime in as well on that same topic.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Colleen Ganley-Ammerman. I'm with the California Community College Chancellor's Office, and my work areas include food, housing, and all things related to basic needs for California community college students, including those who identify as homeless or as housing insecure. I think there's an unfortunate myth that exists about college students and homelessness, and that is that college students couldn't possibly be homeless because they're in college. And so really recognizing this to be a myth, in recent years our office has made some good strides towards understanding how many community college students in California are homeless. And we're also doing work towards finding ways to support those students. We recently added a question to our CCC Apply application, which is our online application that the majority of students use to apply for community college in California. This will allow us to quantify the number of students who are identifying as homeless. It will also help direct us as to where there are more heavy pockets of homeless students. We've been working on guidance to our financial aid officers and to other staff at the colleges to make sure that they're providing critical information to students who report being homeless or housing insecure. And then our big ticket item, we recently partnered with the Hope Center, a national research organization out of Temple University, to conduct a system-wide student survey regarding how well the students are doing getting their basic needs met. The Hope Lab administered the survey to 52 of the 114 community colleges, and we had 40,000 students respond. And so the stats, which are reflected on this slide, were similar to national statistics, so the housing stats were pretty alarming and higher than other states report in terms of homeless students. 60% of our students report having been housing insecure in the last 60 months, and of that 60, 19% report having been homeless within the previous 12 months. Both of our sister systems, the California State University and the University of California systems, also conducted basic needs research across their student bodies. Their data is reflecting 11% of CSU students report being homeless, and 5% of the UC students report being homeless. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges? College students experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity face many challenges to successfully completing their education. Many lack strong adult supporters to help guide them through the financial aid and college application processes, or really just to provide moral support that many of their peers receive through their family and friends. Many experience higher rates of anxiety and stress related to not knowing where they're going to sleep or how they're going to feed themselves, let alone pass their exams or do their term papers. Students experiencing homelessness do not have the security of knowing that they or their belongings are going to be safe from day to day. They're shuffling from place to place and often don't have appropriate places to study and struggle to access guidance on effective educational planning. These students face economic challenges, things that so many of us take for granted, like being able to pay for transportation, food, housing, money for books, college fees. Fortunately, there is some help available at many of the colleges throughout California for students experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. At this time, I would like to hand it over to my great colleague, Shahara Hyatt, who's going to talk about some of the supports that are in place. Shahara?
Thanks so much, Colleen. Yeah, so in part to speak to some of those challenges that Colleen was just discussing, a bill was passed in 2016, AB 801, also known as the Success for Homeless Youth in Higher Education Act, which required every community college and California State University campus to have someone on campus, either in the financial aid or another office, to serve as the homeless and foster student liaison, sort of replicating the model that we see of homeless liaisons in the K-12 system. And it can increase those community connections. So these liaisons inform current and prospective students about financial aid and other assistance available to young people experiencing homelessness and current and former foster youth, and also to provide connection to both on-campus and community resources. Next slide, please. And I'll say shout out to community college for having their roster of homeless liaisons available online and on this webinar. So when we surveyed about 81 college homeless liaisons and others that are working directly with this community, they said that housing was not only the greatest need that students that were coming to them were presenting with, but it was also the need that they were least able to provide to students. And this really underscores the need to connect to the broader housing and homelessness services system. When John Burton Advocates for Youth did a survey of continuums of care across the state of California, about 56% or over half said that they have no formal relationship with their local institution of post-secondary education. So those connections between the community college and COC, by and large, aren't really happening as much as we'd like to see. And I think this highlights the need for the relationship that we're trying to foster today. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Jillian.
And just this is Simone, before Jillian talks, I just also want to just kind of underscore, I mentioned the reason we're doing this webinar, and Shahara and Colleen, you guys have outlined it beautifully. There is a crisis on our campuses that we need to address. And we definitely want to, as you guys listen to Jillian present, she's going to talk about continuums of care and she's going to talk about HUD funding. We really want people to leave this web seminar, kind of, if you leave with nothing else, leave with an understanding of what the continuum of care, the role of the continuum of care is in your community, and kind of understanding that that is the primary strategy to, that HUD funding essentially is the primary strategy to address homelessness on a federal level across our country. And so, any strategy that a campus wants to use to address housing instability, it's kind of understanding that, doing it with an understanding and a knowing of what's available out there in the community, and making sure that you first know what exists out there, so that you can complement it, add to it, connect youth to it, and not be operating kind of in silos. So I'll just say that before we pass it over to Jillian. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Simone. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad that you kind of wrapped up that section with that statement, Simone, because I think one of the things that all continuums of care, and I'll get into what those are actually in a second, they're constantly looking for additional collaborators and want to be coordinating with all the different resources that exist in a community that are meant to serve people experiencing homelessness. And so, just to reiterate, the reason I'm really happy to be here and talking a little bit about the Continuum of Care program and the HUD funding and the way it works is because I would really encourage anyone working with homeless youth to try their best to not just be aware of who your COC is and who the different players are in your community, but actually start to build relationships with them. So thanks. So you can go ahead to the next slide. slide, Simone. So as Simone mentioned, I'm going to be covering just the very basics and an overview of the Continuum of Care program and sort of how it's set up and what it looks like in California, as well as talk through a little bit, and again at a very high level, kind of how HUD funding that's meant to serve homeless people flows through the state. Then I'll also talk a little bit about kind of the very basics of sort of connecting to those COCs because you're going to hear about a more specific way through the coordinate entry system later from another fabulous speaker. So just the sort of nuts and bolts of what a COC is. So a continuum of care is essentially a local or regional system that's set up to coordinate all the different providers and agencies that are working to help people experiencing homelessness or at imminent risk of homelessness in a particular community. So they're sort of umbrella organizations or coalitions. They're not county-based, so it's not that each county has a COC. It's sort of a little more nuanced than that. It would be nice if it were that simple, but it's kind of not based that way. So some counties do overlap. Some of them do align with a particular COC, but that's not always the case. So in California, until very recently, there were 43 COCs in California operating throughout the state. That number has just switched a little bit. A couple of them have merged with one another in a most recent round of funding. So there are about 38 now. So that can get updated. But the main sort of point is just to make sure that everyone's aware that there are a lot of different COCs operating throughout California, and each one is responsible for a particular geographic area. And each one has a point of contact that you can use to sort of get in the door and start to get to know how the COC that operates in your area works. So the COC program, or HUD funding, I should say, is the largest funding pot at the federal level for homeless assistance programs in the country. HUD, of course, oversees more than just homelessness funding. They also oversee home ownership, low-income housing assistance, fair housing, distressed neighborhoods, and housing development generally. So homelessness is a piece of what HUD does, and the COC program is one of the primary ways that funding gets to communities in order to fund the agencies and the providers that are working at the local level to address homelessness. So the amount of money at the bottom there, the $381 million. That was actually those are the amounts that were just announced a few days ago, actually, in the most recent annual round of funding. So every year, each continuum of care applies to HUD to renew all the programs that they're currently being funded by HUD. And those awards just came out for 2018 from the application for last year. So that's the most recent information we have. Next slide. So this slide is meant to, again, a very high overview of how COC program funds particularly flow from HUD into communities. So I just want to, you'll notice it specifies in the HUD, the arrow going from HUD to the COC, that's COC program awards. So there are additional types of HUD funding that I'm not going to get into today that are relevant to homelessness, and specifically things like homelessness prevention that get distributed a little bit differently. So we're focused here on COC funding. So HUD funds directly each COC, so each of the 38 COCs that operate in California applies to HUD for funding. That's then going to be dispersed to all the different providers that are within that COC to actually do the work of addressing homelessness and working with folks. So one entity, usually, sometimes it's a county, sometimes it's an agency, will actually be the applicant for a given COC, and then each community sort of works it out amongst themselves through, again, a process that's too detailed that I'm not going to go into it today, but figures out kind of how much of the money that they get as a COC goes to each provider, each program that's operating individually as part of this coalition. Next slide. So now we're going to cover a few of the types of resources or types of housing that are actually funded through HUD funding. So this is actually that are then administered by the Continuum of Care. So I do want to clarify, because emergency shelter is a little bit different. I don't think, probably for purposes of this webinar, we don't need to go into all the different ways, but emergency shelter is actually funded through a different pot of HUD money, if it's funded at all. So communities that get HUD funding for emergency shelter are not technically funded with COC dollars, but emergency shelters do often and should be operating as part of the COC, and they're subject to a lot of the same requirements, for example, to participate in coordinated entry, which you'll hear about later, as COC funded programs. So that's why they're collected here. So we're talking about the different types of resources that are meant to assist people experiencing homelessness in a given community that are administered by the Continuum of Care, meaning they are part of the coalition that is a continuum of care. So I'm gonna walk through each of these in just a moment, but it's emergency shelter, transitional housing. We're going to talk, those two are meant to be kind of temporary, and then more permanent solutions, those are rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. So I'll get into those in just one second. We also just wanted to mention that there are additional housing resources that are not specifically aimed at necessarily all people experiencing homelessness, or there are kind of particular pockets of money for very specific subpopulations that are kind of available in theory in the community to, and maybe even to some of the folks that you're working with, but they're not administered by the COC, meaning the COC doesn't kind of control those resources. So those are things like housing choice, or maybe you've heard of them as Section 8 vouchers. So those are vouchers people can use in the private market to help subsidize permanent affordable housing. So there's a lot of talk about affordable housing, most of which is actually outside of the context of the COC. And then Runaway and Homeless Youth Act programs are also a separate entity. Next slide. So I'm going to walk quickly through each of those 4 types of housing I mentioned: emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. And I'll touch quickly on kind of which ones are most likely to be helpful for the college students that you're working with that might be experiencing or at risk of homelessness. So emergency shelter, I think, is the one that people are most familiar with. So of course that's meant to be a short-term resource, the primary purpose of which is to, of course, get folks, literally off the street or out of a dangerous situation, maybe to provide some temporary shelter. Usually they're almost always time limited, but the amount of days kind of varies shelter by shelter, and the kind of services that might be included and the requirements for accessing, or kind of whether you can go in and out, or timelines, or all the different rules vary really greatly from shelter to shelter. And as I mentioned before, because they're not funded by COC funds directly, they also vary kind of how actively engaged they are in a particular COC, but a COC point of contact will always kind of have the information about shelters that are operating in the community. Transitional housing has a kind of formal HUD definition, but I think people also often use it to sort of mean as a catch-all for temporary housing. So the idea is it is a type of supportive housing, so it's meant to be housing paired with services that people might need to help stabilize and become able to sustain housing over time. So it's fairly intensive supportive services that are offered. So it's a somewhat expensive type of housing. HUD has it's a little bit out of favor with HUD over the last few years, but young people are actually one of the subpopulations for whom HUD at least is still kind of acknowledging that transitional housing is most appropriate. But the idea is, again, it's time-limited assistance, but it's up to 2 years, depending on program. And a client who's in transitional housing is going to have to move on from that housing at the end of the assistance. So that's why it's considered a temporary type of housing. Next slide. So rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing are both considered permanent resources. So rapid rehousing is essentially a subsidy, so it's meant to help someone move from homelessness into housing as quickly as possible. It's essentially financial assistance. There's often, if any, case management or supportive services quite limited. It's also up to 24 months, but the idea is that you're using the subsidy in a housing unit in the community that you can remain in even when the subsidy ends, which is why it's permanent housing as opposed to temporary. And then permanent supportive housing is a combination of rental assistance and intensive voluntary services, and it's designed for people with disabilities who need support to live more stably in their communities. Next slide. Looking at my time, so I'm a little behind. Okay, so this is just an example. If you think back to the slide where we were talking about how HUD funding goes, or how funding from the COC program goes from HUD into a community, this is just an example. So again, there are 38 COCs in California. This is just an example of one in the counties that it covers. It's called, every COC has a CA dash and then a number. So in this instance, there is a chunk of funding that goes toward rapid rehousing, a chunk of funding that goes towards permanent supportive housing, and then there's also money that goes to help the community run a database essentially that's meant to help track data and services that are provided to folks. So here, the kind of arrows after each of the types of housing are just indicating that there is money that goes towards each of these types of interventions, and then the programs are actually run by different providers in a given community. So again, that money goes through the COC as an umbrella organization and then is distributed out to different providers who are actually running the programs. Next slide. So finally, to wrap up, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware of kind of that, these resources exist, and the COC is an absolutely great partner to work with, and they are administering, again, all of these different resources that are funded by HUD for people experiencing homelessness. But I also want to make sure that we're creating the right expectations for how possible it is to actually access some of these resources for the students that you're working with. So of course, for any resource that is HUD funded, and kind of any resources you all know, there are eligibility requirements. So for all the resources that we've just been talking about, at an absolute minimum, a client that you're working with or a student you're working with has to meet HUD's definition of homelessness. There's also usually additional eligibility requirements for a given program or a type of intervention. So there might be additional requirements, but the HUD definition is the minimum. And then another thing to think about is that really the main reason that any given person, so you might be working with clients who are eligible for HUD funded services, but might not still be able to access them. Essentially, the reason that people are not able to access resources is not necessarily eligibility, right? It's also that there just aren't enough resources, and we all know that from working day to day with folks. So it's important to think about the fact that, and we'll go into this a little bit later when we're talking about coordinated entry and how communities prioritize, but because communities don't have enough resources for everyone experiencing homelessness, they've created these systems by which they figure out how to prioritize the limited resources there are. So again, it's another great reason to really get to know your continuum of care, because you'll get a better sense of how they decide which resources are prioritized for which people, and you'll have a better sense then when you're working with any given student, whether they're likely to meet the criteria, or they're likely to be prioritized as highly as some other people in the community that are all vying for the same sorts of resources. So I'm a little bit past time, so I'm not going to dive into the details of the HUD definition, but I do have a resource I can circulate afterwards that helps to kind of explain, and helps you figure out whether a client that you're working with or a student you're working with would actually meet that definition. So.
Thanks, Jillian. I know we've actually already got questions about the HUD definition of homelessness, so maybe we'll cover it during Q&A.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, great.
No problem. Thanks. So now I'm going to turn it over to Hope Kamer, our Rockstar intern here at J-Bay, and she is going to share a resource with you all.
Hi, everyone. We are going to talk briefly about a handout that we are circulating along with this webinar, and that is the roster of California Continuum of Care contacts. So on your screen, you'll see a link, and if you click on it, and technology is working for us, it should take you to the roster of all the contacts of every continuum of care across the state of California. So I'm going to give you guys a second to go ahead and click on that, let your computer populate it. If it's not working from that link, you can also download it from the handout section of the webinar control panel on your screen. And if it's still not working, you can send us a question and we will send it to you. So we conducted a survey across California, across all the continuums of care. More than 70% responded. We asked questions about the most up-to-date contact information and how to best connect youth and advocates to homeless response systems in each area. As Jillian mentioned, continuums of care aren't run along county lines, unfortunately. So right now we're all going to take a second to find the major city or county that you are operating in. Again, if there's any confusion, feel free to contact us now or after the webinar, and I'm happy to help you figure out what continuum you should be accessing. And
scroll down on the screen here if people want to scroll down.
So right now we're scrolling down the screen so we can all get a good peek. I want you to take a second to find your own continuum of care. We're going to cover what all of these columns. But if we take the example at the beginning, the region Alpine Inyo Mono County, the COC is called the Inyo Mono Advocates for Community Action. They have ID numbers that are delineated by HUD, which are not that important, but I guess good to know. Contact name, this is the person to contact about becoming involved with the continuum of care meetings, email, phone number, and then they often provide websites that have information of how to get involved in a continuum of care. As my colleagues have mentioned, if you take one thing out of this webinar, we want it to be that you know what a continuum of care is, so we're not operating in silos when attempting to support youth at risk of homelessness, and you know who to contact to get involved with yours. So this should be a helpful resource. Most of these are current and up to date, and we're still collecting information on the ones that are not current. And we'll check back about this in a few slides. So back to Jillian.
Thanks, Hope. I'm actually going to pass it over to Jacqueline now as I navigate back to our PowerPoint. So Jacqueline is going to talk about the coordinated entry system. So again, very important information for all of you to better understand how to connect youth to services.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much, Simone. So as Jillian shared, HUD requires all continuums of care to implement a coordinated entry system, which is also sometimes known as a coordinated or centralized assessment system. One way to think about coordinated entry systems is as a network of entities and programs that have adopted a set of shared principles and approaches to their work and that coordinate together to make sure that individuals in need of housing resources are connected to the types of housing that are the best fit for their needs, regardless of where that person first walks in the door or what type of program first assesses the person's needs. One of the goals that was mentioned by Jillian of coordinated entry systems is really to prioritize households who have the highest needs or vulnerabilities and to make sure that we're utilizing housing and services that are available in the community as effectively and efficiently as possible. And so before we dive into how a coordinated entry system operates, I want to briefly share why the system was developed. And so if you look at this slide, the maze on the left depicts what one could experience trying to access housing resources in a community that does not have a coordinated system. So as you can see in the maze, the path to the various houses that are in the maze is complicated. You may have to make several stops or turns before going the right direction toward a resource, or you may go through the whole maze towards a particular house when really a house at the other side of the maze is a better fit for your needs. And in this model that existed previously, there was no consistent way of knowing if households that reached the housing resources at the center of the maze were those that needed it most, or if it happened to be those who got there at the right time or who knew how to navigate the system best. And so coordinated entry seeks to address those concerns. It is a design system that aims to ensure that there's fair and equal access to the housing resources that are available within a community. So within coordinated entry, there's one streamlined process for gaining access to a community's housing resources. As you can see on the right, there's route-like pathways at the bottom of the image, and those really show that whatever pathway a household takes to enter the coordinated entry system, that they end up at the same point, that they end up at a similar and same assessment process, and that referrals to housing are then organized through that streamlined system. And as a specific housing resource becomes available, a household or individual is referred to that resource based on their specific needs and strengths. Go to the next slide, please. So prior to CES, if you were making referrals to a housing resource, typically you would make referrals to a direct housing provider. For example, if you were trying to connect a young person to a transitional housing program, you would make a referral directly to one or more transitional housing programs in that community. That system required people who are making referrals or trying to get access to housing in the community to have a really in-depth knowledge of all the different types of housing programs that were available in the community, and also of all of the intake processes for each agency. And so coordinated entry aims to try to create a more streamlined process and one that's more accessible and easy to navigate for those who are needing to access housing resources, and also for the agency and support providers trying to assist them in that process. And so this slide really outlines the basic flow of how a coordinated entry system works. And the details of what it looks like can vary slightly from community to community, but the basic structure, infrastructure is the same. So for example, at the start of a coordinated entry system is the access phase. And this is how a person first connects with CES. So we'll review this more on the next slide, but to share briefly, this is the places or ways in which a person can learn more about potential housing resources in their community, and where they can start to share more about their particular needs. And so depending on a community structure for CES, it may be that there's multiple ways to access CES in a given community, or it could be that there's one centralized agency or program that acts as the point of access for all housing resources in the community. Once somebody connects with CES, there will be some type of standardized assessment tool that's used. And that tool is used to really better understand the needs and strengths of a particular person or household. One of the goals of the assessment phase is to really use the same process across the whole community and across all programs for gathering information about a household's needs so that there's a consistent and transparent process. The information that's gathered about a person's needs and strengths is then utilized to make uniform and consistent decisions about who will be prioritized for housing resources. As was highlighted in the discussion on continuums of care, in most of our communities, there is a greater need for housing than there are current housing resources available. And so coordinated entry systems allow us to make strategic decisions that are informed by data and informed by the needs of participants about how to prioritize who is able to access resources that do become available. So often, groups that are prioritized for housing include those who have been experiencing homelessness for longer periods of time, those who are particularly vulnerable on the streets, or those who are most likely to require assistance to end their experience of homelessness. At the next stage of CES, referrals are made to housing resources that become available based on an individual's needs and based on who's prioritized for resources. The specific types of resources that are made through CES can vary by community. It typically does include the COC housing types that were reviewed by Jillian previously, but also can include other housing resources that the community has determined to administer through CES. Throughout the process of CES, agencies also are constantly working with households to help identify other potential resources outside of CES that may be able to help somebody to address their housing needs. So for example, this may include helping a household or a young person apply for mainstream benefits like CalFresh or CalWorks. It can include doing problem solving or mediating with family members or friends to find out if it's possible to stay with them. It can include referrals to workforce programs or legal services, really with the goal of bringing as many systems and partners together to support a household in gaining what is ultimately the goal of safe and stable housing. And so through CES, whether it's through accessing a housing resource that is referred through CES or through connections to mainstream resources, the goal is that all households who come into contact with CES are able to get connected to safe and stable housing as quickly and as effectively as possible. Next slide, please. So how does someone connect to CES? To access CES, the first step in most communities is to contact a CES access point. There are many different models that are used for this, and so in your specific community, it may look different than in other continuums of care. This slide highlights some of the different models that are used across different communities. So for example, some communities have a single point of access into their coordinated entry system. That would mean that there's one agency or one site that's designated for all people to go to in order to access the housing resources that are available through CES. Other communities divide their continuum of care into regions and operate regional hubs or points of access. There also is allowable multi-site hubs that focus on particular groups of people. So for example, there can be a hub that specifically focuses on working with young people or a hub that specifically focuses on working with families. Some communities also offer virtual or phone access to the system in addition to having physical drop-in sites where people can go. And then other communities designate all agencies in their community or many agencies in their community to adopt the coordinated systems assessment processes so that no matter what agency a household walks into, they're able to move through the CES process flow and complete a CES assessment. And this model is often called a no wrong door approach. And finally, outreach teams that do street-based outreach and connect with people on the streets or in parks or in other outdoor locations also often serve as access points into CES. And so the particular model that's used within a continuum of care can vary based on multiple factors, whether that's the community's geographic scope or the number of agencies that are able to carry out the CES functions. And so it's helpful to talk with your continuum of care or lead agencies to find out the best way to connect students to CES. So for example, here in LA County, our system operates with multiple points of access, including access points that are specifically targeted towards youth and families and adults. And outreach teams and crisis housing programs also serve as a way of connecting with CES. And so we maintain a list of access points on our website that can be used by community members to know where to go or where to refer someone if they're experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. And so as I mentioned, some communities do choose to operate a separate system or to have separate access points within their system that are specifically targeted towards youth and young adults. And this is really in recognition that some young people may not feel comfortable or safe going to programs where older adults are present. Additionally, youth-specific services really take into account the developmental needs of young people and incorporate principles like positive youth development or peer supports and navigation to make sure that it's an environment and a process that is really tailored towards where young people are and their needs. And so this lists some of the common features that can be found either in youth-specific access points or in youth-specific coordinated entry systems. Some of the goals are to operate a safe and accessible space for young people. There's typically designed assessment tools that are really informed by the unique experiences and vulnerabilities of young people. There's often developmentally appropriate housing and service resource options that are offered in the system, like transitional housing programs. The network is made up of providers with expertise, with experience in working with young people. And the programs that operate within the system use really youth-centered approaches to both engagement and supportive services. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Hope, who will share more about how you can find out if your community has specific ways for young people to access CES, or if there's recommendations on where to send young people in your community.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. So now we're going to pull out our roster again, and we're going to look at the far right column that says Status of Coordinated Entry System. As Jacqueline rightly pointed out, this is going to be unique to the area you're in. So that is why it's important to become familiar with the homeless response system in your area. We gave this survey to the COCs across the state. Most people responded, but some did not. So if no one responded from the COC, you'll see that the status of the coordinated entry system is unknown, but there is a contact for you to reach out to find out more about the homeless response system. If you look, for example, at Fresno City and County, COC, they have an operational coordinated entry system, so a more general coordinated entry system for the general population, and then they have a youth coordinated entry system. So if you're interfacing with a young person experiencing homelessness, they are going to be enrolled and served by the youth coordinated entry system. Finally, if you take the example of Imperial County, this coordinated entry system is still being developed. So the person to contact is listed as the CES, as the coordinated entry system contact, Luis Torres. So you can give that person a call or send an email to the contact listed, and you can get information about how to most effectively get your young person absorbed into the homeless response system, which is sort of colloquially used in place of coordinated entry system when the coordinated entry system has not yet been developed. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Hope. Okay, so this roster, like we said, is available on the handout section, but it's also available on the link on the screen, and where that takes you is to the JBay website. So you can always visit that, and we will do our best to keep it as updated as possible. And if you have updates to it, please do send them our way. I've already gotten a couple messages from people saying, I have an update for you, so please continue to send us those. All right, so next we are going to dive into some practical strategies. These are things that campuses can really, some they can do immediately, some might be longer term, but many are very kind of low barrier ways to connect youth to the homelessness response system, and even some things that campuses can kind of do internally or on their own to support young people. So the first strategy is know your community's access points and refer youth to those access points. So we just heard Jacqueline talk about coordinated entry, and that there's these access points that are utilized for people to connect to services. So kind of, I mean, this is an obvious strategy, but know what those access points are, right? Know at least where maybe the access points are that are closest to your campus. Specifically, if there's any youth-specific access points or maybe youth-friendly access points, that would be a good thing to know. And then, of course, if your community has a youth-coordinated entry system, campus staff should definitely know what the youth CES access points are. So that's probably the most key information to have. And then, you know, when staff are coming into contact with youth experiencing homelessness, you know, this should be kind of their go-to referral. And it would be good to know, for staff to know kind of what the community's process is like. So maybe what does the assessment process entail? How long does it take? I think it's always helpful to take the mystery out of this for youth or for students so that they know what to expect. And as you know, we surveyed as we mentioned earlier, we surveyed the continuums of care in California, and one of the questions we asked was how many access points each of them had, because we know that it ranges quite a bit. There's really, really large communities like LA, and then there's much smaller regions, and so there's quite a range in the number. And so, you know, about 9 COCs had anywhere from 3 to 8 access points. I think 5 continuums of care had anywhere from 15 to 25 access points, and then a handful of continuums of care had over 50 access points. Of LA, of course, is one of those. And then there's communities with youth coordinated entry systems, and in those cases there was, and I think there were 7 of those. Is that right, Hope? And those with coordinated entry systems specifically for youth, there were usually a few youth-specific access points. So, maybe 3 or something like that, and they were usually at the location of where service, of a service provider. So in those communities, I would think obviously that campus staff would want to know where all of those youth coordinated entry system access points are. So the next strategy, even better than the first one, or in addition to the first one, co-locate with a provider that assesses for coordinated entry, right? So if you have a provider coming on campus and administering the coordinated entry assessment, you don't have to refer youth to an outside access point. It can take place on campus. So this is a really great strategy. You basically have a staff member from a local provider come on campus, say twice a week, and deliver the coordinated entry assessment. And this takes out the third party. We know that anytime you have to refer youth somewhere else, you want to do a warm referral or a warm handoff, as people say, but we know that even better, it's have it happen on campus. So this is something that you could do. You could reach out to your continuum of care about if you know the local providers that deliver coordinated entry assessments. You could reach out to them directly and kind of discuss getting some sort of agreement in place. And so to kind of talk about what this looks like on the ground, we've asked a campus that does this to join us today. So Cecilia Cruz from East LA College is going to talk a little bit about what it's like. Homelessness, Inc. is the service provider they work with, and they come on campus. They have a navigator come on campus and deliver the assessment. So we want to hear what that is like, how it helps students on Cecilia's campus, and kind of understand how a campus might go about setting that up.
So hello everyone, thank you for being here. I'm Cecilia Cruz, coordinator for the Student Health Center at East Los Angeles College. I've been in my role since about the summer of 2017 and getting more involved with issues of student homelessness and food insecurity over the past year. So we have had a peer navigator on our campus for a little over a year now. And she was already in place when I began working on these sorts of student issues. Our peer navigator is from an organization called Homelessness, Inc., as was mentioned, and she is located in our EOP&S office. And so this partnership began as a collaboration between EOP&S and Homelessness, although the peer navigator does assist students who may not be a part of those programs, the EOPS program. So far, they've assisted about over 50 students, and also have provided services to adults, not necessarily just youth. The peer navigator is here on our campus about 30 hours a week. And just as an example, just this morning, I interacted with our peer navigator. A student was referred to me who is facing homelessness. I called up our peer navigator. I gave her an overview of the situation. The student then called the peer navigator right then and there. And I'm assuming they were able to connect and get going with the initial assessment. I will follow up on the situation later and also be sure that the student we're talking about is connected to other resources and support services that she might need. And I would say that for colleges that are considering starting a collaboration like this one and having a peer navigator on campus, some points to think about would be, first of all, where would you want to house this person? How visible or accessible to students can you make this person, or would you like to make that person? On a college campus, we don't always have the luxury of space or choice of space, and there are always pros and cons to wherever you might end up needing to put this individual. Our current situation right now with our peer navigator, she's not really visible to anyone who walks into the office, and you would sort of need to know that she is located in that office. So we're trying to see about other ways of promoting the services, letting students know that we do have services available, and not just students, but also our faculty and staff. For example, having our peer navigator or someone from Homelessness table when we have different events, and also with more flyers and information on social media. So that would be one thing to think about, placement, housing of this person. Also, I would recommend really thinking about communication with key departments across your campus so that, one, they know the partnership is in place, that there is a peer navigator on campus, and you may want to think about communicating with offices such as your student health center, your student union, your welcome center, your food pantry, places like that. I would say that our campus as a whole here at ELAC really is focusing a lot more on trying to address issues like homelessness and food insecurity. So just making sure that the key individuals who are a part of those efforts, leading those efforts, are aware and in the loop. Personally, I get students referred to me from all across campus for a variety of issues that they're facing. Food insecurity, unstable housing, maybe transportation issues, health concerns, mental health issues, domestic violence, financial troubles. And as we know, a lot of these different struggles can be tied together with unstable housing or homelessness. So I think it's helpful to have an individual who is connected to resources, the peer navigator for the housing, but also other resources to address these other challenges. For example, connected to CalFresh, Medi-Cal, to your on-campus mental health and health services, your on-campus food pantry, DSPS, your financial coaching available on campus. I'm also a member of our campus's behavioral intervention team, so that gives me another avenue to connect with students who may be facing unstable housing and, get them the help that they need. So look at individuals who are kind of hubs like that on your campus, who just by the nature of their roles are in a good place to be able to interact with and identify students in need and provide them those additional resources that they might benefit from. So kind of thinking about a holistic approach to addressing the students' needs and also how that collaboration and communication can look. Also, I'm going to say that being aware of agencies that can assist people who may be on your campus who are homeless but are not students, maybe who are, living on your campus or, just on your campus a lot, they're not students and they do need assistance, having some resources for them, should they want them. Promoting your services, the services that students can connect with, Flyers, we have a flyer around campus with various hotlines and resources. The peer navigators information is on there, along with a lot of other information. This flyer is available to students, faculty, and staff. And we're also coming out with a new flyer that's really directed towards students, very simple and direct in its message. If they're facing unstable housing, homelessness, to get in touch with this number, this email address, and that'll come to me. Again, with the idea of passing them on to our peer navigator immediately, but also addressing their other needs should they have them. So that was an overview of the on-the-ground perspective, and I'll pass it back to Simone.
Thanks, Cecilia. And I'm going to ask, I think Eric now is going to talk just a little bit about how this might be funded, because I'm sure that's a question that campuses have, and how they got started.
Thanks, Simone, and thank you, Cecilia, for that great overview of the partnership that Homelessness has with East LA College. Just really briefly about Homelessness, we provide pretty much all of the resources that were listed in a continuum of care for youth experiencing homelessness between the ages of 18 to 25. Means emergency shelter, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, and rapid rehousing, as well as other services like prevention and diversion and family reconnection. So we're really focused on helping youth move into permanent and stable housing so that they can move along with the rest of their lives. And we started working specifically with community college students in the last few years after we started hearing about these statistics and about just the rate of student homelessness and the sheer need for housing resources on campus. And so we, came up with a really great partnership with East LA College, where we would partner with predominantly at first their Guardian Scholars Program. And we actually had an arrangement where East LA College was funding half of a position and Homelessness was funding half of a position. That was our student liaison, someone who was in the Guardian Scholars Program who would be able to make referrals and make that warm handoff to Homelessness and our case managers to assess youth who are experiencing homelessness and then connect them to the rest of our housing programs. And this was around the time that CES, the Coordinated Entry System, was being developed and implemented in Los Angeles. And once CES, especially the youth system, became available and became online, we were able to really tap into that resource and really understand how do we break down the silos between housing programs and the schools that we want to be partnering with. And so that really developed into a relationship where we were able to use CES resources to place a peer navigator onto the community college campus, like Cecilia was talking about. Our partnership with the EOPS office, and our peer navigator, who is actually a current community college student with lived experience of homelessness, who's been helped by Homelessness through CES. So she has, a lot of ways that she can relate to the students that she's getting referred, and then, really talk them through how Homelessness is able to help by using all of the housing resources and other types of services at our disposal. And so, in order to make sure that we're able to fund this position, we tap into coordinated entry. Oftentimes there is funding for peer navigators, or, you can use it as outreach funding. We also look into other types of public contracts. Right now our East LA College peer navigator is funded by a contract with Department of Health Services, which is really looking into, how do we connect more and more young people with housing resources and other types of supportive services. So it's a great leveraging opportunity. We've also, at times funded these positions. We have 3 peer navigators, and sometimes we fund them with private funding as well. So as we continue to develop relationships with, local foundations and others that are interested in addressing student homelessness, we can talk about the need of making sure that these resources are available to students on campus so that they can get assessed at a location that's very convenient for them, that takes out the stigmas oftentimes of having to go to a shelter or another type of big housing program, and meet someone who they can really relate to and understand what the process is to get housed. So it's been really great to see these types of relationships develop. And, you know, how do we continue to fully integrate community colleges, the schools that we work with the coordinated entry system, and also explore other ways that we can partner together. So another great partnership that Homelessness has with East LA College is by partnering with the foundation to actually provide support funding to house students. So we recently received a grant from the East LA College Foundation of $10,000 in order to, you know, use that as a way to actually house one student who's currently experiencing homelessness, and also to extend the length of time that we can provide a rental subsidy to another East LA College student. So basically the way that our peer navigator is able to connect students with our housing resources is by using the Next Step tool as a way to identify what the needs are of the student, and then working with the rest of our CES team and our rapid rehousing team predominantly in order to get that student housed and use housing as a tool to help that student succeed in college. We're really excited that we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and how we can continue to grow these partnerships with the schools that we're working with.
Thank you, Eric, for that background. That's really helpful. And I'm sure if campuses have questions about this partnership, they could contact you or Cecilia. Is that all right with you guys?
Yes, that's fine.
Absolutely.
I think it is. Okay, great. So we're going to jump kind of back into the strategies now, and I'm actually going to turn it over to Hope to cover the next few strategies.
Thanks, Simone. So one thing that we want to keep in mind that it sounds like Homelessness is doing really well at East LA College is to make sure that key campus staff are familiar with eligibility as it's outlined by HUD. The HUD definition of homelessness, which we will discuss in detail in the question and answer section, is specific, and youth that you or I might consider homeless will not always fall into that definition. Further, different housing options have different eligibility standards. As my colleague mentioned, permanent supportive housing, for example, is not going to be available to a young person unless they have a documented disability, whereas rapid rehousing is more open. One other thing to note, and that will occur less often, but is another reason why you should be familiar with the landscape in your area, is that there are some local service providers who might serve youth who don't meet the HUD definition of homelessness, but are housing insecure. So if there are providers like that in your area, it's important to know about them. If a young person is sleeping on their friend's floor, they're not necessarily going to be considered homeless under the HUD definition, but they clearly are in a tenuous housing situation and could use the support. One other thing to make sure key campus staff are familiar with is how to serve young people with care histories. So histories in the foster care system. If a young person has a foster care history, they might be eligible for robust services outside of the coordinated entry system's offerings, and this is an important diversion to make. Even if they're just potentially eligible, it's important that we look into that. For youth who are 18 to 21 and were in foster care until their 18th birthday, they may be eligible for extended foster care. If youth have exited foster care and are under the 24 to 25-year-old cutoff, they might be eligible for THP+. For more information about THP+, THP foster care, you can check out our website, you can call me directly, and we're going to share some links at the end of the PowerPoint to talk about services for young people with foster care histories. Next slide. So the next strategy we're going to talk about is using touch points with students strategically. Essentially, this means when a young person contacts you for support, it's often going to be the case that they're also in a tenuous housing situation. So if a young person comes to you for an emergency housing voucher, a motel voucher, that is the time to direct them to the coordinated entry system. When you're distributing basic needs resources, you should make sure that these students, if they are homeless, are completing the FAFSA correctly so they get the maximum amount of need-based aid available to them. Finally, and we touched on this in the East LA College presentation, posting information about coordinated entry in food pantries, in health centers, in the exam rooms of health centers, Getting the information of the person on campus who, without judgment, can meet a student and tell them about the housing options and the coordinated entry system in their area is really, really important. Next slide. So attending care coordination meetings is a great thing to do if you are trying to integrate your campus and your students into the coordinated entry system of your area. If you don't know, care coordination meetings are a setting wherein providers from every arena, housing, mental health, basic needs, sit down to discuss a care plan about a specific student. Campus staff, if they attend these meetings, can share the unique perspective and advocate for the young person as they are a college student. So we need to make sure that their education is made a priority in their care plan. Attending these meetings, say on behalf of a student that needs to see their behavioral health counselor at 9 a.m., this advocate is going to be able to say yes, and they need to be back on campus by 11 so they can go to Sociology 1. Next slide. Finally, we really encourage you to get involved with the Continuum of Care stakeholder meetings during critical input periods. This last year, the state of California released $500 million to address homelessness across the state. And when a large grant like this is released by HUD, every Continuum of Care has specific planning process meetings wherein the needs of that specific community are discussed, and the use of the funds is chopped up, delineated. Attending these meetings as an advocate of the experiences of your homeless students helps ensure that your young people who are facing homelessness will get the funding for the services they need. So yeah, and then there are times of the year when this critical input is more necessary. So one thing to do is to really take a look at the schedule of your Continuum of Care when they're meeting and when money is becoming available and how they're deciding what to do with it.
Thanks, Hope, and sorry to trip you up there. I interrupted real quick. I just wanted to say that HEAP wasn't HUD funding. I wanted to make sure we gave our state credit for this amazing investment in homelessness, and this is something that we're very excited about here. So moving on to the next slide, the next strategy, participate in the homeless point in time count. So this is a very timely webinar because the point in time counts are happening now or have in some cases just happened. HUD requires as a condition of funding that continuums of care conduct an annual count of homeless persons that are unsheltered, or excuse me, that are sheltered in emergency shelter, transitional housing, and safe havens on a single night, and then a count of unsheltered homeless persons every other year. Some communities choose to do the unsheltered count annually, or sometimes they do broader counts like a youth count, to inform their own local planning processes. But the information gathered in the PIT count is the main source of data used by the federal government to track the number, demographics, and needs of people experiencing homelessness. And so it determines federal funding allocations to address homelessness. So you can imagine it's an incredibly important thing to make sure that we are counting accurately, which is really challenging. Each PIT count is planned, coordinated, and carried out locally, organized by the Continuum of Care, and so it requires the efforts of a lot of community volunteers. And like I said, they're happening now. Some communities are literally doing them today, and some have maybe done them earlier in the week. Maybe some have not yet completed theirs. So if you want to get involved, today is the time to make that phone call. Campuses should consider kind of having a staff, volunteer for the PIT count, and if too late this year, the next year. But in the least, make an effort to be informed about it so that you can ensure that homeless students are counted. There's an actual roster, a Continuum of Care roster for the PIT count that we'll have on the last resource pages of this PowerPoint, so that people can reach out to the right person if they want to get involved. And we just got a message from someone saying, please reach out to the local libraries for the point in time count as well. So thank you for that message. So the next strategy, ensure your campus's financial aid policies address student homelessness. So this is there's about 4 different things we've listed here. I'm pretty sure there's probably a number of other things we could have here, but then we'd be doing a whole webinar on financial aid, and that's not what today is about. So I'll go over these 4 strategies And then, you know, I'm sure that there are things that many campuses are probably already doing some of these things. I know for a fact that they are. And there's other things that campuses might be doing in this area as well. But first, just ensure, this is a basic thing, you know, ensure financial aid administrators are well trained and advised on how to make a homeless determination, right? So campuses, I think, might first want to ask themselves kind of what percentage of our student body are considered independent students on the FAFSA by way of a homeless determination. My guess, and you probably would agree, is, you know, considerably less than the number of students that are actually experiencing homelessness and that meet that definition. I think we really need to work on, you know, ways to get financial aid into the hands of homeless youth who are missing out on it because of sort of administrative barriers. One thing is to ensure that administrators are well trained and advised on how to make the determination, and to not have sort of, you know, the gatekeeper attitude that I think is sometimes we are trained to have when we are working with a large, you know, administering funds to students, but more of an open interest, you know, in using their discretion to ensure homeless youth are going through this process so that they can get that important independent student status that makes them eligible potentially for you know, need-based aid. So next, reevaluating the cost of attendance based on individual circumstances. So campuses can reevaluate the cost of attendance. It's something they have the discretion to do. And, you know, as campuses well know, unmet need for financial aid is calculated by subtracting the expected family contribution from the cost of attendance. And so if the cost of attendance is kind of artificially low because of systemic problems and how it's calculated, you know, that's going to create an inaccurate unmet need. So if your cost of attendance is not accurate and your unmet need is not accurate, and it's going to cost you more to live than calculated, you're not going to have enough aid. And if there isn't enough financial aid available for you to, you know, say meet your unmet need of $13,000, and the only aid you qualify for is $6,000 Pell Grant, then maybe it's a moot point. But if you get a robust financial aid package and you could get more money, like $15,000, and your unmet needs only been calculated at 13, then, you know, you're missing out on that additional 2,000. And so I think in these scenarios, the financial aid office should really find a way to reevaluate unmet need so that we can make sure that that homeless youth are getting kind of the maximum aid that they can. So next, prioritize special populations for timing of disbursements. So campuses can also, you know, there's a lot of discretion. The student handbook, if you look back at it, there's a lot of areas that say, you know, financial aid offices have discretion here. And so this is another one in prioritizing disbursements. And so obviously this isn't prioritizing who gets financial aid, but rather prioritizing the order and timing that students might get their actual disbursement. So they have the discretion to prioritize, you know, special populations to ensure that, say, in that first batch of students that receives their aid, so that they don't have to wait for that money. You know, as you can imagine, when you don't have any support, cash flow is a major issue. And having your disbursement, you know, this week instead of next can mean the difference between homelessness and housing in some cases. And we know that campuses do this and would love to see others kind of follow suit. So lastly, modifying your appeals policy to make homelessness an extenuating circumstance. So campuses can modify their policy to make homelessness kind of officially an extenuating circumstance for appealing the loss of financial aid. There's language in federal statute regarding appeal that says that a financial aid office can evaluate whether there are certain circumstances that warrant continuation of aid. And so, you know, campuses could say in their policy that homelessness is one of these special circumstances. So moving on to the next strategy, so ensure your campus is fully implementing AB 1393 and AB 1228. So these are bills that establish priority housing for priority student housing for at CSUs and UCs for current and former foster youth, and then for current and former homeless youth. They also requested it at the community colleges. And the requirements refer to student housing generally, in addition to year-round housing or housing that's open for the most days in a calendar year, without charging during breaks. So that's really key. And the definition of homeless youth that's used here is homeless during 24 months preceding application. and under age 25. So it's the same definition as you know, in AB 801, which established priority enrollment for homeless youth. It's that same kind of preceding 24 months preceding the application. And lastly, consider providing temporary housing on campus. So campuses with student housing should, you know, this is a great strategy just to consider setting aside some dorms to be used as emergency short-term housing for students experiencing homelessness. And this can be great to sort of supplement what's available in the community, largely because we know that there are wait times to be housed and not everyone is going to qualify for that housing. Another strategy to assist students in need of emergency housing is to provide hotel vouchers. This is obviously a more viable option for, say, community colleges where they're not necessarily providing student housing, so they're not going to have dorms, but can also be a great supplemental strategy to supplement the set-aside dorm housing. So I'm very quickly just going to turn over to these resources here. The Continuum of Care roster that we reviewed earlier is there. Also the point in time count roster I mentioned. The AB 801 liaisons that Shahara mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, the roster of those at the community colleges is there. And then the 10 practical strategies for campuses that you see at the bottom, that's essentially what we've just gone over. Those 10 practices are all captured on a like a 4-page document. And then here, 5 guides to help homeless college students. This is something that was put out recently by the California Homeless Youth Project. You heard from Shahara earlier. That's the organization that she's with, and Schoolhouse Connection. And they go over a number of really great pieces of information on specific topics. I think housing supports, CalFresh, FAFSA, and then mental health services, and then I think one's also on supportive services. So those are great to review. And then JBay put out a FAFSA visual guide last year, and this is something that walks you through every page of the FAFSA with special considerations for homeless youth. And then the rosters that Hope mentioned. So the THP Plus roster for former foster youth. So this is literally the list of providers that offers this program for former foster youth up to age 24 or 25 in some counties. And then on the very last on the list, there's a link for information about extended foster care. And then there is a THP Plus FC roster, which is the transitional housing foster care placement, and that links to all of those providers. And if you want any more information about any of this, please feel free to reach out to us at a later time. So I'm turning it over now to our Q&A. We have a lot of really great questions, so I'm just going to dive right in. So let's first get to that question that was brought up in the beginning about eligibility. This person said, can we be clear on the definition for homelessness as it applies to college students? For instance, does it always include students who live with their parents but meet the McKinney definition, such as doubled up, hotel, etc., or does it only refer to students living on their own, such as independent, unaccompanied? Jillian, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm glad the question came up, and I'll try to be quick because I know we have probably a lot of other questions too. I'll provide a resource to John Burton advocates so they can hopefully pass it along. That's something that HUD put together that kind of provides an overview of this too. But there are 4 categories of homelessness according to HUD, which is obviously relevant for all these HUD-funded resources. So category 1 is literally homeless, and that's the one that I think people are most familiar with. So that's individuals or families who live in a place that's not meant for human habitation. So that can include people who are living in their car, on the streets, in emergency shelter, or in hotels. I think this is what was referred to in the question. Hotels or motels that are paid for by a government or charitable organization. That's literal homelessness. There's category 2, which is imminent risk, which is someone that's, so this is where doubled up or kind of couch serving could count if the person meets the rest of the requirement, which is if it's an individual or family who's going to lose their primary nighttime residence within 14 days and has no other resources or support networks to obtain other housing. So that could count depending on whether the housing is precarious enough that you can demonstrate the person's going to lose their housing within 14 days and doesn't have other resources. Category 3, which is the only category that specifically mentions youth, is that if there's an unaccompanied youth who's under 25 years of age, or a family that has children and youth who don't meet any of the other categories, but they're homeless under another federal definition. So for example, the Department of Education. But there's a couple more requirements. So if that's the case, the person also has to have not had a lease, have moved 2 or more times in the past 60 days and is likely to remain unstable because of special needs or barriers. So that's worth looking at more closely, because even though it mentions youth specifically and does broaden the definition a little bit for young people, there are additional requirements, and so oftentimes a young person is more likely to fit within one of the other categories of homelessness. And then the final category 4 is if someone's fleeing domestic violence. So if you're fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, and lack resources and support networks to obtain other housing, that also qualifies as homeless within the HUD definition. So those are the 4 major categories that are required. You have to tick one of those boxes if you're going to be considered homeless within the HUD definition. But again, I would kind of just reiterate what's been said a couple times during this by Jacqueline, and I think Hope too, that just because if you think that someone is not actually meeting one of these definitions, but they still need housing resources, we would still recommend, I think, contacting the COC or the coordinated entry, because again, there are resources that are available that the coordinated entry system or the COC will sort of be aware of, housing resources that they might be able to connect a student with, even if they're not meeting a specific eligibility criteria, or even if you think they meet that criteria but are not likely to be like prioritized as highly vulnerable, so they're to kind of get those scarce resources. I would still say, familiarize yourself with these definitions, but still don't hesitate to reach out if someone needs housing or related source resources.
Thanks, Jillian. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. There's definitely, in Jillian's presentation, she, briefly mentioned that there are these other programs that are not administered, for example, by the Continuum of Care, such as RHYA programs, and they're a great resource. And so, we definitely don't want to, like you said, deter people from referring to coordinated entry or referring out to that provider who might know of that information just because they think they don't meet the definitions. I think that's a great point. Also, you mentioned maybe having a tool that you could send us that would help kind of, because obviously people are not going to memorize what you just said. So, whatever you have, visual, information, if you have something written out or something graphic, anything would help if you want to send that along, if you have a useful tool for understanding the definitions.
Yeah, I definitely will, and I'm also happy to answer additional questions over email after the fact too.
Perfect, thank you. On a related note, talking about definitions, someone asked, what is the definition of youth for a youth coordinated entry system? Jacqueline, do you want to, as far as age, do you want to take this one?
Sure, absolutely. So the definition can vary slightly by continuum of care, so it is beneficial to clarify in your community. But most often the term is either referring to young people between the ages of 16 and 24 or young people between the ages of 18 and 24, depending on how a community has structured its services.
Thanks, Jacqueline. The next, I want to say before I go to the next question, some campuses have chimed in and said that, and kind of listed some of the practices they do. Thank you so much for sharing these. Some people have mentioned that they have people coming on campus to assess. We're so excited to hear that. Someone also mentioned that they developed a handbook that they give out to those that work with homeless students. So thanks for that, and continue to share those resources so that we can, amongst one another, so that you can get these practices. We can get them wider and happening at more campuses. The next question is about assessment, and someone asked, are there recommendations for what a community uses to assess individuals to best accommodate youth needs? So, I guess maybe talk about the, Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about the assessment that you guys used in LA for youth?
Sure. And maybe Jacqueline can also hop on about this too. But what we tried to do is make sure that we're using the assessment that's used for the coordinated entry system as our main tool to understand the needs of any youth that we're meeting, including community college students. And the reason why we're doing that is because we're relying on both the funding that coordinated entry system and the LA Homeless Services Authority can provide. So we have to make sure that when we're placing youth into housing, that they do meet the definitions and the eligibility criteria. And two, it's an important step to really show that there is a coordination and a common, tool that's being used between the colleges and the housing system in general. So by using the Next Step tool, which is, the tool that's being used by any youth provider here in Los Angeles, we're also showing that there's a replicable process that any provider can do or any school can do. It's using the common assessment that connects youth to any of the resources that throughout the coordinated entry system that they're eligible for, and really understanding what their needs are and their what their goals are. We can collect additional information from the youth and students that we're working with that really understand what they're how they're doing in school, and that helps us develop a better case plan for them. But we want to make sure that we're also using a common assessment that we can use to transfer that information to any other homeless service provider, so that in case Homelessness isn't the agency that's going to be housing a youth, we're using a common language that another agency could use to get that youth housed as well.
Thanks, Eric. And someone just said that they would love to see the handbook that I mentioned that someone chimed in about. So if this person and I'm trying to find them in the Q&A, and now I've lost that question, so I can't find the person, but I'll follow up with you individually later and see if you might be willing to send that handbook around to share with other campuses. So here the question is, are all California community colleges required to have a homeless student liaison? Colleen or Shahara, do one of you want to touch on that?
Hi, this is Colleen. Yes, all of the community colleges and CSUs, and I think UCs were requested to have these folks, are required to have a person either in their financial aid department or in another appropriate department to make sure that the students receive information about, first and foremost, the financial aid that they're eligible for and their status as independent students, but then also to make sure that the students are aware of other campus resources that they might be eligible for. We do have a directory on our website that I'll send a link to the website where you can find a full directory of the 801 liaisons. And I think it is important to note that it's not a funded initiative, it's an unfunded initiative. And so the capacity at each of the 114 schools does vary, but there is a point of contact at each one of the community colleges that students can reach out to.
Great, thanks, Colleen. And just one more question for you. Someone wants to know about the data shared at the beginning of the webinar. Is that available somewhere online? Referring to the data you shared, Colleen.
Yeah, the data was just released. It's not online. We will be working with the Hope Center, and a full release of all of the research will be available on March 7th. There'll be a public event probably at the Capitol, and all the full research findings will be released at that point. So those 3 data points, they're not published online as of yet.
Okay, thanks. And then I think we have time for one more question. I think, Jacqueline, this might be for you. What is the difference between a youth coordinated entry system and a youth-friendly or youth access point?
Sure, absolutely. Each community has kind of its own structure in terms of how coordinated entry operates, and so the terms can be used somewhat interchangeably in that sense, in that typically for a youth-specific access point or a youth-friendly access point would be places where the services and kind of design of the program is specifically tailored to meet the needs of young people. The primary distinction between it being a kind of youth-specific access point or a full youth-specific coordinated entry system would be whether or not the other phases of the system are also specific to young people. So for example, in some systems, the kind of where you go to access resources may or may not be youth specific, but then the matching to or referrals to housing resources themselves are done across all ages of people together, whereas in some communities that have a youth specific system, kind of referrals and connection to housing resources as well is also kind of separated out and done to really make sure that it's focused on the specific housing resources available for young people or focused on connections to providers that specifically serve young people.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And since we're actually still at 11:29, I'll fit in one more question. Are there necessary next steps, or are there necessary steps to provide the next step tool? Do I or anyone need to get certified to be able to use this tool? Maybe, Jacqueline, this might be you or Jillian,
Sure.
maybe? Question for one of you guys?
Sure. So each continuum of care does use, has its own assessment tools. And so, for example, here in LA County, that is the name of the tool that we utilize, although other continuums of care do utilize other tools. And so it is really up to each continuum what that process looks like. And so in LA County, if there are people who are interested in finding out if they may or may not be eligible to administer the tool in our continuum, they could reach out to myself, and I can follow up and share more about what the specific requirements are for agencies and programs interested in being a participating agency for CES.
Thank you. So that concludes our webinar. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists and all of our wonderful attendees. We hope that everyone has a great rest of the week. And if any questions come up at a later date, please feel free to email me and I can route them accordingly if they can't be answered by us here at JBay. Thanks.